Welcome to Still Life Illustrating. This is Professor Jim Kinney, otherwise known as Prof to Go, and we're going to be illustrating fruit. And we're going to start with the teacher's favorite, the apple. Okay, so we're in the Illustrator homepage. We're going to create a new file. So click Create New. And I'm just going to use a letter and an orientation of wide, also known as landscape. So here we are. Now, the thing about still life is that there are often situations where you have a resting surface and a background. So for that, I'm just going to create a back wall using a rectangle. So I'll choose the rectangle tool and draw my rectangle out. And I'll just fill that with a color. And no stroke. And in the interest of time, I'll just copy that. I'll use the selection tool. And just hold the Option key down, and the Option key will make a copy. The Shift key will keep the copy nice and straight. And so for this, it's going to be my resting surface. And no stroke. And it's going to lighten that up a little bit. There we go. And just change my CMYK sliders just a little bit. There. So we've got our background essentially. This will be our resting surface. This will be our background wall. It's important to have background elements because part of what still life is all about is capturing highlight, shadow, color, and texture, and also indicating reflectance as well as translucence in some cases. So backgrounds are really important in terms of they can be surfaces on which shadows can be cast, as well as surfaces upon which reflections can appear if the surface properties are shiny. So they're important signals to the viewer in terms of the physical realities of the space you're trying to create. Now, another thing here, I'm just going to play with this dimension, and you'll notice as I move this up and down, it really changes the perspective. If you think about the joint between the wall and the resting surface as being the horizon line, this really tends to shift the perspective up and down. So I'm just going to stretch this down a little bit. This gives us a sense of being in close, fairly in tight towards the wall. So that's going to be the background. Again, I'm just going to use the Workspace Essentials Classic, which is located right here. I'm just going to reset that workspace back to its starting function. I'm going to click here just to give me a double column toolbar. I prefer that. There it is in waiting. And then further to that, I'm going to be using the color panel, so I'll tear that off, collapse the others, and I'm also going to be using the appearance panel. We'll tear that off, collapse the others, and also the layers panel. So on the layers panel, let me just click on the flyaway menu here, and I'm going to go to Panel Options and make large icons just so we can see the elements that are sitting on our layers. This layer 1, I'm going to double click it, rename it background. Hit return, and now I'm going to click new layer, and this one I'm going to double click it and I'm going to call it apple. Hit return, and there we have it. I'm going to draw the apple on this layer, obviously, and I'm going to lock down the background for now, just so they're not accidentally selected. So now that I'm on the apple layer, I always begin my drawing by deconstructing the scene and the elements in the scene into primary shapes. And I usually will begin with a primary shape and then work from there. So an apple is probably closest to an ellipse, and then therefore I will begin drawing an ellipse. And I'm just going to choose a color here. I'll expand my color menu so I see sliders. And I'm going to choose just a sort of yellowy green color. I'll now draw my ellipse. So this is going to be my apple. I'm just going to move it here for a second. Now it's always a good idea to keep some copies of your original shapes intact. So I'm just going to Option drag a copy here, and this one here I'm going to hide. I'll just move this in here. I can bring that other copy back later on if need be. So we're starting with an ellipse. Now the way in which we're going to color this ellipse is using the mesh tool, which is located right here. So the way in which we add color is using the mesh tool, and the mesh tool works by sectioning the object that you apply it to. So if I click down here, it automatically breaks it into vertical and horizontal slices, creating quadrants. Now you'll notice that it generated an intersection point, which is currently active and solid, and all the other points around the outside are hollow, meaning they're shown for position only, but they're not active. Given that this point's active, I can change its coloring at any point. And what it does is this new color then blends to the existing colors outside here, 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 and here. So it generates a gradient in 8 different places. You will also notice that I'm just going to use my direct selection tool, that this point can be moved around. And it's essentially stretching the paint. You can kind of see it there. And each point has direction lines associated with it, so we can literally bend the gradient, almost like finger painting. And just as it is in Illustrator, in Illustrator we could hold the Option key down and we could actually make those direction lines rotate independently. Not so with the Mesh tool. We need to actually go into the Pen tool suite and choose the Anchor Point tool, and then that would allow us to grab a direction line and establish independently rotating direction lines. So it gives us a greater degree of autonomy over how the color is distributed in that object. I'm just going to use my Command Z or Control Z on your PC just to get us right back to the starting point. So again, with the Mesh tool, when we click down, it generates a quadrant. If we click inside an existing quadrant, it subdivides that space again. If I click on a horizontal, it gives me a vertical line. If I click on a vertical line, it gives me a horizontal. If I use the Option key, you notice as I roll over each point, a minus sign appears in the Mesh tool. And if I click down right now, it's going to remove this point. In effect, it will remove both a vertical and horizontal grid line. If I Option click on a vertical, it just removes that vertical. Likewise, a horizontal. And again, if I Option click on an intersection point, it removes both. So once again, we drop that in. I can choose another color, maybe kind of warm it up a little bit. Go to a sort of yellower green. And if I click down here, I could choose some reds. And notice again, it's blending out to those different colors. And possibly up here, we could be looking at strong highlight colors. I'm going to assume a light direction from the top right. It's always important to make a strong choice and be consistent with that choice in all of your renderings, particularly if you're putting multiple fruits together in a composition like a still life. The lighting has to be consistent, not just in terms of its quality and color and intensity, but also the directionality of that light. So I'm sticking with top right. That's a fairly standard convention. And now I'm going to use my selection tool, the direct selection tool, just to come in here and select these points. And I'm going to use the letter I, which activates my eyedropper tool, and I can select a color that exists on my gradient already. So again, Command to click, Command toggles from the direct selection tool, which I had previously selected, and then allows me to select, and then when I release, I have access to my color sampling or eyedropper tool. So Command toggles to the direct selection tool, release, sample the color. Command, release, sample the color, and I can continue in this fashion, on and on. And I don't have to just sample this color, I could sample this color. Transition much more softly. Again, I've selected this, which is green right now. I could choose something that's about a third of the way. And all it's doing is kind of bleeding that color up gradually from one area to the next. It's giving us a very gradual transition. And again, I can Command and click on that. Essentially, I've sampled that color right there. And then U gives me my mesh tool. So I could drop my mesh tool in here and add a little bit of subtlety in the color. I want to go for some pinks in there. And again, just going to zoom into that quadrant a little bit closer. Remember the Command key, select this, and now I key gives me my selection. Now I could sample this color directly, which would create a dispersion pattern, much like we're seeing here, down here. Or I could choose an intermediate color right here. And it just gives a more gradual dispersion of color. Command, and I'm going to click here, sort of in the intervening area, and it very subtly blends that color. Again, same thing, just a very subtle dispersion of color. Maybe a little bit there, and there we have it. From this point now, I want to add some texture. And the way in which I'm going to do that is using the brush tool. And I'm going to use that in conjunction with, so I'm going to go to Window, Brushes. This is my brush panel. Just going to close that. And you'll notice at the bottom of the brush panel, there's a little stack of books. And that means your brush library is accessible here. The brushes that come canned in your brush panel are fairly limited. So if you want to extend that, you click on the library and choose from all of these different brushes. I'm going to use artistic ink. There's a number of spatters. Notice as I click them, they're being added into my panel up top. There's one that I'll use, and I'm okay with that. Maybe one more. They get added in here. I can close the library. I've signed out the tools that I'm going to use. If you double click on a splatter, you can alter the behavior of that splatter how it's being applied to your objects or your scenes. If you double click on the tool, the paintbrush tool, what you're doing is gaining access to controlling how the tool behaves when you're moving your mouse or your keypad finger or your stylus on your pad. When you're moving that around, you're telling it how you want it to behave. And, for one, here's a fidelity marker. If you're making lots of fine movements, you would probably want to use accurate, where it's going to translate it using a lot of anchor points. However, if you have a shaky hand, you could use smoothing, in which case it'll use fewer anchor points, and any path that you create will be nice and smooth. So this removes detail, this way increases detail. I usually like to start right in the middle. Now we have to choose a stroke color. So I just want to make sure we've got that flipped and we choose a dark color for the stroke. If I double click that stroke, I want to use this feature right here, scale proportionately. And what that means is if I make a long brush stroke, the spatter pattern will be much larger. And if I make a short one, the spatters will be relatively smaller. So again, choose my brush, very large spatter by doing a long stroke. A very short stroke gives a much smaller spatter pattern. So important to keep that in mind. I'm going to use a relatively small one, and I'm also going to make sure that I use an appropriate blend mode. So for that I'll use the appearance panel, and let me just expand that, and I'm going to set the opacity for that to multiply, and I'll put it at an opacity of around 50, well, maybe about 30%. So it's subtle. Subtlety is really important. And I may want to soften that up by using an effect. So I click the effects button, add a little bit of Gaussian blur to that. Now I've blurred it right out of existence, but I can bring that in just so it's a very subtle mottling of the apple surface. Now just to show you how the different blend modes can give you very different results, I'm just going to use the Option key. I'm going to pull that out there. And again, I can use that direct selection tool to just stretch this in different ways. It follows the path that we had generated for it. So you can see we can alter its curvature and so on. So now that I've got that, let me try a different blend mode. So there's screen, doesn't seem to be doing much. Overlay, hard light, well, we're getting more of a shadow in there. Color dodge, let's use that. Oh, color dodge is giving us lighter speckling. So I'm okay with that, so I might use color dodge as well. Combination of light speckles. The best thing to do is actually to study the work of the masters. The best is if you went to the Rijksmuseum in the Netherlands, they have a website where you can look at the works of Vermeer or Rembrandt, and these artists did exquisite and in-depth studies of the behavior of light in various compositions with people, still life, etc. And so I look at things like this for inspiration, how painters use light in their compositions. And you can see here in the copper bowl, it's not only accounting for the copper through the coloration with the reds in it, it's also accounting for the geometry. You'll notice how these very straight sticks of asparagus in the foreground are being bent to conform to the spherical or convex geometry of the bowl. You'll notice it's also accounting for the behavior of light in terms of color change. So there are slight shift changes in the hue. The yellow that's bouncing off of this apple is now hitting a red colored surface, and now the light bouncing back to the viewer's eye is the yellow mixing with the red, which results in orange. The green mixing with the red is resulting in a brown cast to the asparagus in the reflection. And you'll notice these very strong highlights are indicative of surface texture. These surfaces are very smooth because they're large, solid white highlights with very sharp borders on them. Slightly less defined borders on the apples. Notice the highlights here are very diffuse on the asparagus, telling us that the surface properties of this asparagus aren't quite as shiny as the other two subjects. So accountability is key. Be faithful to the physical world. The fact that all of these pairs, besides their exquisite coloring, all bear highlights that are slightly diffuse around the edges to tell us something about the shininess of this surface. But the fact that they're all in the same location tells us that they're in the same location, under the same lighting, because of that consistency. And you'll also notice the shadow that this pair is casting on the other pair binds them to the same physical space. They're reacting to one another. And you'll notice that the shadow is bending to conform to the topography of that pair. Notice that we have the silver plate down here. Now we can't see mirrors or silver or glass for that matter. All that we can see is the effect that they have on light. And the fact that they're reflecting these pairs tells us that right here is a resting surface which is very, very shiny. And you'll notice these little specks of light here. These are bouncing strong sources of light back to the viewer's eye. These are specks or spectral portions of light. It's specular light. And they're very strong points of light on a highly mirrored surface. And you'll notice these little deviations here indicating that there's etching on the surface of that plate. Again, the reflections of the pairs are giving the brain hints to the geometry of this plate. Glass and silver are very much like trying to paint the wind. We can't see the wind. The only way that we could indicate that it's windy in our composition is by showing leaves blowing through the air, showing a tree bending away from the wind, showing a flag fluttering in the breeze, or a hat blowing off and hair tousled. We can't paint the wind, we can only paint its effects. And it's much the same with rendering very shiny or see-through surfaces. If we look at this composition of glass, we're seeing glass as represented by light coming from other objects moving through it. If we look at this vase in the center, you can see that the painter is accounting for the refraction of light. That's the bending of the light as it moves through a substrate, whether it's a liquid or it's a quasi-solid like glass. It bends, and you can see the refraction here. In fact, as it passes out through the other side, it refracts a second time. So really being accountable for physical reality. And we're seeing strong highlights. We're seeing through the glass here to a shadow cast on the wall. We can tell the pattern on this glass because it's drawing the red and drawing the blue down into these grooves. They're reflecting the light in significantly different ways. If we look at this structure over here, This is a diamond etch pattern common in crystal glassware, and you can see the effect that it's having on the light coming through it. It's fractured, almost crystalline. And we can see the dimples in the glass here implied by shadow, meaning that these are recessed. We're not actually creating these things, we're just creating the illusion of them by mimicking the qualities of light as they pass through an object and are caught on a wall. We know this is a wall because we can see the slightly colored shadows of these glass objects. We know that this is a resting surface, like a table, because of the way the shadow is caught here. Very different geometries. You'll notice the shadows bend up the wall. And so we need to be mindful of these different geometries and in how we represent shadows. There'll be very different trajectories when they're on a flat resting surface versus the trajectory of the shadows that are cast on a vertical wall. It's all about accountability. And here we have some lovely coppers, again, lots of reds. We've got reflections here. We can tell that this is a copper counter in a kitchen. And there's lots of diffusion of that light to give the illusion that there are scratches. Notice again on this large glass demijohn that there is lots of breaking up of the light here. That's indicating that there are scratches. A copper kettle, we're seeing slight reflections, slightly diffused, but those reflections are necessary for signaling to the viewer that this is a copper counter. Without those reflections, we lose the quality of reflectance, and without seeing this bowl coming through here, we lose the quality of translucence. So again, we need to account for those things. It's great to study the real world. Take a look at objects in nature as they exist and do a study. Observe where the highlights are, how they're behaving. Look at where the shadows are and how those shadows bend around the surfaces. And what are the textures and the colors at play? Look at the plum, how it has that speckling of white. Look at that rough surface texture of the orange, and so on. Again with the apple, you can see the light spattering. You can see radial elements here as well. These are things that we need to account for. And so I will do one more. And this is a still life of some oranges and apples in an aluminum container. Brilliant studies, of the dimpling of the orange here where it was attached to the stem, the rust in the apples. This is a lemon by the looks of it, but expertly done. So look for your inspiration and guidance from the masters. Filmmakers and directors and photographers always begin their visual research with the masters. Let's start with the texture. We use our brush. We'll just take that brush and we will apply an opacity of color dodge, and we'll lower the intensity so it's a little more subtle, and then we'll apply a little bit of a blur, Gaussian blur. And again, with the preview button switched on, we can actually see a live preview of that happening as we increase the amount of blur. And again, so I'm just painting in those speckles in the apple. And you'll notice it's spilling out here at the bottom. But I'm not worried about that, because later on we're going to take a look at another technique called masking. And we'll be able to use that to great effect. And again, I'm just going to select this piece here, and that'll set up the brush in such a way that it'll use the multiplying blend mode as well. So again, just getting a nice little wash of textures that I feel kind of work with that. There. I've got the textures for my apple. Again, it's experimental. You can play around with it. Yes. The next thing I want to do is put shadow in here. And to do that, I'm going to use the Blob brush tool. And the Blob brush tool, if you double click it, you can play with its size. You can squish it. You can rotate it in any way, shape, or form. And then if I click OK, you can see it here. It's rather too large. I'll take that down a little bit. And here we have it. I'm going to bring it in here. And then I'm slowly going to encroach more and more to the interior of the apple. And then slowly just taper my way back out. This is going to constitute my shadow. Now there's a lot of points in here. So I would strongly suggest that you go in here and that you choose the smooth tool. So again, I'll select this and I'll use the smoothing function on it. Just drag across it, reduces the number of points, and gives us a nice smooth boundary to work with. That looks good. I'm happy with that. So you can see how it's casting a shadow. If need be, I could take this, go to my selection tool, and you notice the bounding box around the shadow element. If I move towards the corner, I get the rotate function, and I could rotate that shadow element like that, and that might be more suited to what I want to achieve shadow-wise. And I set it up like that. I notice that there's a little bit of extra here, so I'm just going to erase it. Command Z, right here. So I use the erase tool, and now I've got it set up. This is where that other circle comes in handy. So I'm just going to bring this into play right now. If we look down here, we have a circle, but I'm going to bring it to the very top of the stack. So I'd grab it and drag it all the way up to here. So you can see now that spare circle is sitting at the top of the apple layer. Again, I'm just going to move this over, and what I'm going to do with that is select all of the things on the apple layer, and I'm going to say Object, Clipping Mask, Make. And you'll notice that it trims the shadow. Now the shadow right now is a little too intense. So I'm going to select that, and in the Appearance panel, once again, use the Effects, Blur, Gaussian Blur. And I'm going to apply that blurring to it so that it's a more diffuse shadow, just like that. Nicely sculpts some shadow into that. And at any time, I can move it to suit my needs and rotate it or whatever. The other thing I want to put in there is a highlight. And for this, I'm going to use the pen tool. I'm going to imagine in creating the highlight that there's a window off camera. This is the wonderful thing you can do with respect to highlights and reflections, is that you can imagine the world beyond or behind the viewer, or the other side of the room. And I'm going to imagine here, if you will, a window that's sort of behind the viewer's back, so that they're looking at this apple up close, but behind them there is a window. And the light coming from that window is going to reflect in this apple, because the apple surface is going to be shiny. So I'm just going to close my brush panel right now, just to give me a little more room. Spacebar command or spacebar control on a PC, just to zoom in a bit. A window is square, But when the light from that square window hits the apple, it has to conform to the surface geometry of the apple. So I would expect that projection of that square onto the spherical surface would bend itself. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a bend. I'm going to bring this down here. I'm dragging to create curvature. Again, I need to go over this point and hold down the Option key to get the curvature tool and establish an independently rotating direction line for that. And I'm going to pull it out like that, space bar to get the grabber hand. And then I want to come down here and give it some curvature, Option key, get an independently rotating direction line. We'll do likewise, put more curvature in there. And again, Option key, independent rotating direction line, and back to finish it off with the Option key with another independently rotating direction line. That's one pane of the window. I'm going to do the other one. I could probably make it easier on myself if I just duplicated this, although it's not going to match perfectly. But I'm just going to use my selection tool, hold down the Option key, and then I can, well, maybe I could just flip this. Just grab the, no, that's not going to do it. I'll just make some quick changes using the direct selection tool. So if I click on there, I can alter the curvature slightly. And again, I'm just going to bend that up there so that taken together, they all make a curve. And there we go. I just want to open that up just a little bit. So you can see how I'm crafting that window. I want the two panels of the window to form a consistent curve. There, I think that does it. What I'm going to do is fill those two with a gradient, because highlights, like shadows, often dissipate as well. So I'm going to use the gradient panel right here. I'm going to just fill it with an ordinary black and white gradient, but I got to make sure, Command Z or Control Z, that I'm dealing with the fill. Activate the fill, fill it with a gradient, and then I will use the gradient tool right here. Notice they have separate gradients, and I just drag to give them a consistent gradient like that. Now in each of those gradients, I want to make sure that for the coloration of this point, so you'll notice that here's the gradient slider, that's the start point and the end point, that I activated the end point on my gradient. You'll notice that it's currently monochromatic. I want to make sure that it's full spectrum. So I add some cyan, magenta, and yellow in there with the black. And what that's done is it's created, and I've got to do that over here as well. Make sure that this also has CMYK. As a matter of fact, I could use the eyedropper tool and simply sample that. Now they're the same. It slightly shifted my gradient, so I'll just do Command Shift, select both of those, and again with my gradient tool, give them a singular gradient. You'll notice that it's reserving the white up here. I can shift the black by moving this diamond one way or the other. So that looks about right to me. That diamond represents the midway point, where the start color and the end color are mixing at 50-50. Also called the speed of the gradient. I want to change in the appearance palette its opacity blend mode. And I want to set the opacity blend mode to overlay, or maybe it's screen. Let me take a look at screen. Yeah, I guess screen could work. Yes, screen is much more satisfying. So we can see now this window being reflected in the apple. That's a signal to us that this is a very shiny surface because we're seeing this window out here. We could even go so far as to craft it such that I'm going to use the pencil tool for this. There's the pencil tool. I'm just going to draw a cat. And that cat's going to be sitting in the window. I'll just give a tail to that cat. And again, I'm just going to scale that cat. Rotate that cat. Maybe it needs to be a bit smaller. And go to the corner, rotate it so it's in line there. And then what I want to do, just zoom in for this so we can see what's going on. What I'm going to do with this is use the Shift Select. So I have all of these things selected. Using the Shape Builder tool right here, I'm going to use the Option key to subtract. So I'm going to remove this from here, also from here, and here. So what is it we've done here? Well, we've created the illusion that there's a cat sitting in a window looking outside. You know, we could even put a silhouette of a bird up there, or even a tree out here in the background to help craft the illusion. Now this is like a little Easter egg that we're sticking in here. Most people on seeing it wouldn't observe it right away, but we have a cat in ours. And it's all very subtle, but it's indicative of a secret world that lies beyond the frame. And a lot of painters would do this. If you look at M.C. Escher holding an orb, it would reveal details of his study. So we've done a reflection, we've done a shadow, we've added color, we've added some texture. The only thing I have neglected to do so far is create the dimple at the top here. Make sure that I'm on this object with the mesh, and probably want to lock everything else down for now. So I've just locked everything except for the mesh. So I should be able to access that. There we go. Okay, so in selecting that with the mesh tool, I'm going to put the dimple right here. So click down. The best way to describe this is sort of fencing it in. If you think of that as a lonely little sheep, and we're going to box it in. So I'm going to click here. Then I'm going to click over here, and then down here, and here. This is the center point that I wanted to work with. And typically I would put a double fence in there just to stop the spread of the paint. I'm going to be using a very dark color here, and it would blend all the way out to here. I want to maybe create a very sharp transition, but we'll see how it works here right now. Command key, nope. I want to be on my direct selection tool, and I want to select this point right here and give it a very dark color. That's going to be that dimple in the apple. Now let's see how we can manipulate the grid lines to make this effect even more believable. So for one, you can use a direct selection tool, and if we pull this down, you'll notice that it creates a very abrupt transition. And if we kept going and we crossed one line over the other, we've actually broken the geometry. We're not in the grid anymore, as it were. But notice that the further away the 2 points are, the more gradual the gradient. The closer they are together, the sharper the transition is. And if I go too far, I'm in danger of creating, you can just see these little artifacts appearing. And that's when this occurs. You typically don't want the direction lines crossing over one another like this. You definitely don't want your lines, your horizontals crossing over an existing horizontal, because that invites all kinds of unpredictable little visual artifacts. But that would be good enough right there. And then I would just shorten these direction lines so that they're not actually crossing over one another to the same degree. We can pull that in a little tighter. There. Okay, so other things we can do. Well, I could stretch this way, in which case it's kind of pulling it in that direction. And if I were creating an orange, I would probably pull a lot of these things in different directions to create like a star-shaped hole at the top. But that's not what we want here. You'll notice that as I pull these things, it stretches that curvature there. Again, we can do likewise here. Stretch that out a little bit. You will notice that when I actually create new lines, they'll follow that curvature. So what does that mean exactly? Well, I'm just going to pull this out as well. And again, we can hold the Option key down, Option key, and we can flatten out that curvature. Give them all independently rotating direction lines. Sorry, I can't do that with the Option key. I've got to use the anchor point tool. So we can make these things independently rotate. So we have a high degree of control over the distribution of color in each one of these things. Again. And now you'll notice that I'm just going to use I for eyedropper, just to select a color. Now, if I click down with the tool here, you notice that it's conforming to that curvature. That allows me to bring in some more pinks, or here. I for eyedropper. U, if I drop in, I for eyedropper, I'm going to select color there. U to get my mesh tool, and I could click more of a mesh there if I wish. And then I could use the Command key to gain access to my direct selection tool, I to get access to my eyedropper, and I could start adding more color in. And so I'm using existing color for this. Command 0. You can see that I'm creating these very, very complex gradients of color. The next thing I want to do is distort it a little bit. I want to unlock everything with the exception of the kitty cat. So I'm going to leave those as is, but everything else I'm going to unlock. Well, I guess it doesn't really matter about the brush strokes and such. So I'm just going to keep those locked. Everything seems to be open. So I've got the mask open and unlocked, and I've got the mesh as well open and unlocked. I'm just going to lock that down as well. So I've selected them now. I'm going to use these distortion tools right here. Underneath the width tool, we have a suite of them. I'm going to use the warp tool. And the warp tool, if you hold the Option key down, you can actually customize its size and its shape. Then you can create some interesting warping effects. And again, double-clicking a tool, you can determine its intensity and the degree to which it's going to distort. So all those controls are worth experimenting with. I'm just trying to match up the angle that I have with the apple. So 90, let's go to 100. Yeah, that's better. You see how the angle of this thing matches up with this more. So with this, I'm just going to push it in like this to create a little dent in the top of that apple. Option key, I'm just going to make this round now. I can push the apple in this way as well. As that Option, just make it a little bit bigger. There we go. There, I like that better. It's more indicative of the real world. Nothing's perfect in the real world. There's our apple. It's slightly distorted. And now I want a shadow. To create that shadow, I need a copy of this outside mask right here. So I'm just going to do Command C, Command V, and it just pastes it out. And I'm going to fill that with black or some dark color. That's going to be my shadow. But again, with the Appearance palette, I'm going to make that shadow multiply. Always when doing shadow, make sure you multiply it. I'm going to drop it down to about 35%. How much blur you add depends on a number of factors. How intense the light is to the environmental objects behind it, like the resting surface. Obviously, it'll be touching the resting surface, but depending on how far it is from this wall, will determine whether or not the shadow is very intense or not. Also, depending on the surface texture. If this is cloth, shadows will be more diffuse along their edges. If it's a highly shiny surface, the shadow edges would remain sharp. So there are a number of factors to consider. If the wall texture was rough and this was very shiny, I'd actually have to construct the shadow in two parts. Use a very hard-edged shadow down here and a very soft-edged shadow up here, maybe with lots of disruptions in it. And maybe we'll do that just for fun. First, I want the shadow to reflect reality. The shadow is going to be skewed on an angle based on, the height of the light relative to the apple and so on. And the best way to do this is using a thing called the Skew Tool. It's found here underneath the Scale tool. The Shear tool. This is a hard one to control. My best advice is zoom out, so you've got a fair bit of distance. Click on the object, then move far away from that object, and then start to move around. Small movements will often generate exceedingly large results. So I'm trying to get that shadow on the right angle. And I hold the Option key down so that it's created a copy in that format. And the copy of the shadow, I'm just going to move over here for now, because I'm going to run that up the wall. And here's this other, let's move that shadow up there. I need that to go behind the apple. Okay, I need it to have some blur, but before I do that, I'm going to trim it. So I don't need this stuff here, I just need it up until it meets the wall. So I'm just going to use a rectangle. Draw the rectangle just along here, just to match the wall geometry. Then I'll use my selection tool with the Shift key, select the shadow, and you've got it. We're going to use the shape builder with the Option key to remove those components that we don't need. I'm going to add very little Gaussian blur to this. So we go into the Appearance menu, add a little tiny bit of blur. I think that's suitable. Once I've done that, so it's blending, 35% multiply, little bit of a Gaussian blur on it, and I want to send that behind. So I want it to go all the way down to the bottom here. So I drag it so that it's below the apple, and I think I've gone too far. There we go. Okay, so we have that shadow, and now we need to contend with this one as well. I'm just going to Command X to cut that out, select this shadow, and Command F just to make it paste in front of this shadow's layer. I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to meet those two shadows up, and now I'm going to use rectangles to cut them out. Cut away the parts that I don't need. Okay, so there's the first rectangle. Make another rectangle down here, just basically trimming off the edges here. Then we'll use the selection tool, hold the shift key down, and we'll select that, and then we'll use the shape builder tool with the option key to remove what we don't need. We don't need that or that. Boom. You can see that the shadow is moving up the wall in a manner that's consistent with the lighting. If this wall is rougher, then in the appearance panel, we need to change its opacity, drop it a little bit because it might be further away, and also we need to use a Gaussian blur from the effects menu. And we can choose how much of a blur that's going to be. Now I'm going to put a lot of blur on it, like so. And you'll notice there's an issue here. You can see that there's a halo because it's blurring all the way to there. So what if I move this down, but now it's multiplying one shadow with the other? We don't necessarily want that to happen. So what I could do is simply use another rectangle as a mask. So if I come here and go here, I'm just going to make it an outline so I can see below it. Then I use my selection tool, select that shadow, hold the shift key down, select that, and then use Object, Clipping Mask, Make. It's going to trim that cleanly at the bottom. You can see that it's a nice clean trim. I just Command X to remove it. Let me just move that just a wee bit there. And then Command F. And now these things can exist in the same world. There's a little bit of a halo. I just have to nudge that a little bit. But you can see it's signaling two very different properties. In fact, I could select this, and instead of having it just black, have it filled with a gradient. So that the shadow, if I use the gradient tool and set the gradient in this fashion, and you can see in this case, it nets very different results. I'm just trying to rotate this just a little bit just to get the angle better. Okay, the different behaviors, the shadow, and I'm just going to blur that a little bit more. We can transition the shadow and make it, using a gradient, have it dissipate. Again, I probably would use a mask just so we don't have blurring on this top edge, but allow for it everywhere else. So we're signaling aspects of the behavior of the world in real life. Now here I can see that part of my shadow is leaking out here. This is essentially the boundary for my mask, and I'm just going to make a little adjustment to that mask Just pull it in here a little bit. Alter that curvature. There, and that's tidied that up a little bit. Sometimes when you distort the mask as well, it doesn't quite conform to the same level of distortion as the mesh bearing the color, so you might have to do a little tweaking. The last thing I need to draw now is the stem. I'll use a pencil tool. I'm just going to follow this curvature here at the bottom, then come up. I think I'm overdoing it here in terms of its size. That's okay, we can shrink it down. So I've created this. I'll just fill it with a solid color. There's a very dark color. Let me just scale that down to the realm of believability. And we drop that in. I just want to add some color with the mesh tool. So we'll drop that up there, some there. So we have a host of different possibilities in the mesh. And now I can just start to add some highlight colors in there. Maybe come in a bit closer so you can see what's actually going on there. I can use my eyedropper and just select things in that fashion. And again, you can see that can be quite effective. I'm just going to leave it at that for now. And so we have the stem, we have the apple, we have accounted for everything. A resting surface, shadow, the geometry of a wall and the surface properties of the wall. We've accounted for coloration, texture, highlight, the little dimple in the apple as well. So there you go. Draw an apple and give it to your teacher and make them happy. And it'll reflect in your mark, trust me.